If you are loyal followers of VisualPolitik, you will have surely noticed that there is a topic that we have always been particularly fond of. Oil. Well, and Argentina, as you already know. The fact is that crude oil continues to have an enormous influence on international politics. That is why, every time large new deposits are discovered, it is exciting, especially if they occur in developing countries, or in countries that, let's just say, have not previously been notable for their energy resources. That is often the preamble to many political and also economic stories. We love it. This was precisely the case of a relatively unknown and sparsely populated country that we have already told you about several times here on VisualPolitik. I'm of course talking about Guyana, the same Guyana that now faces the challenge by Bolivarian Venezuela for the control of the Essequibo. However, this time we are not going to tell you about Guyana, but about its even lesser known neighbour, Suriname, for many the most promising country of 2024. Located between Guyana, French Guiana, and Brazil, this country, with around 90% of its territory covered by the Amazon rainforest, is one of the smallest in South America, and also the least populated. It has only about 600,000 inhabitants. Suriname, which was first sighted by Christopher Columbus in 1498 and colonized by the Dutch from 1667 onwards, is a country that has typically gone rather unnoticed. Let's just say that it does not have a particularly important geostrategic position. It does not have a developed economy, nor does it have resources of great significance. Or at least that has been the case until now. You see, just a few years ago, Suriname went from being a total unknown to being in the global spotlight following this news.
Total and Apache tout significant oil find in Suriname waters.
Since then, the country has been in the sights of both big oil companies and many major world powers. Why? Because with the discoveries made, Suriname's bubbly black gold could become one of the most lucrative in the world. Right now, the industry hopes that Suriname can follow in Guyana's successful footsteps and become a major supplier of crude oil, which, given its small population, could make it an immensely wealthy country. So, VisualPolitik community, how has Suriname come to this point? Why are so many hopes being pinned on this small, unknown country? Could the conflict over Essequibo Guyana disrupt its plans? Well, you know how it goes. Step on the gas, and let's get started.
Suriname, young and turbulent.
Since Suriname's creation as a fully independent country in November 1975, this former Dutch colony has not had an easy history. The country's situation, as was also the case in neighbouring Guyana, was devastating, with massive poverty and a very unproductive, underdeveloped economy based almost exclusively on mineral exports. The situation was such that only 5 years after its independence in 1980, what typically happens in these cases also occurred here. A coup d'etat took place. And with that, someone who is surely the most important figure in the political history of this young nation came to power. Desi Bouterse, head of the National Military Council after the coup d'etat. Bouterse promised the return of democracy by 1982. However, with no sign of that happening, that very same year, thousands of demonstrators took to the streets and confronted the military regime, which decided to execute 15 opposition demonstrators. Following this, all financial aid from the Netherlands and the United States was immediately suspended, dealing a death blow to the country. Suriname's economy remained severely stagnant for a long time. Social and economic tensions reached such a point that, in 1985, Bouterse agreed to begin the road to a return to democracy, which was completed in 1987. Nevertheless, the ex-dictator, who must have missed being in power, staged another coup d'etat in 1990. However, this second dictatorial period lasted only a few months, and in May 1991, elections were held again after pressure from the United States and the Netherlands. Since then, democracy has remained stable. Even so, the same cannot be said of its economy. As you can see, everything started to change with the new century. Starting in 2001, the commodity supercycle began. That is, the rise in commodity prices. Suriname, like its South American neighbors, benefited greatly from this. But the boom times came to an end in 2015, and Suriname once again collided with the harsh reality: mining. Its main economic activity was not enough to get by. Yet, that same year, year, news arrived that turned the hopes of this forgotten country upside down.
ExxonMobil announces significant oil discovery offshore Guyana.
It had already been known since the 18th century that there were hydrocarbons in the Guyana-Suriname basin, but no significant amount had ever been found. As you can imagine, once the black gold gushed in Guyana, the next target was going to be Suriname, and thus exploration soon began in 2016. Suriname was not a new country in terms of oil exploration and exploitation. It started producing its first barrels as early as 1982. In fact, it has 3 onshore fields with reserves of about 1.1 billion barrels, exploited by its state oil company, sparsely. However, those fields and wells would be left in the dust after everything that began to be discovered in 2020. Listen up.
The oil hope.
2020 was a key year for Suriname, and not only because it had to deal with COVID-19, or because former dictator Bouteflika lost the elections after 10 years in office. 2020 was a key year for Suriname because the first major oil fields were finally found in its waters. Oil giants Apache and Total Energies found the first signs of large oil reserves. They have since found up to 5 fields in Block 58, with estimated reserves of some 6.5 billion barrels of oil in these fields alone. Crazy if we factor in that the country has only 600,000 inhabitants. Bear in mind that, taking into account the onshore field, we are talking about 12,500 barrels of crude oil reserves per capita. We are therefore talking about potential profits of more than $550,000 per capita, and that's with most of that amount going to the public coffers. But that's not all. The story is not over yet. Other companies such as Chevron, Shell, and the Malaysian state oil company Petronas have also signed up to this particular VIP party and are exploring the various blocks in Suriname's waters. And guess what? Each of them are hitting new and juicy discoveries. So, as you can imagine, in Suriname, they are thrilled about all this. They believe they will actually be able to replicate Guyana's economic miracle. For those of you who don't remember, Guyana has reported reserves of 11 billion barrels in its offshore fields. Fields that have allowed it to be the fastest growing economy since 2022. In fact, some analysts point out that by 2040, Guyana could raise as much as $160 billion, an amount equivalent to $200,000 per capita in the next 17 years alone, and that is without taking into account other economic activity. Truly outrageous. However, for the moment, Suriname does not have reserves estimated to be as large as those declared by Guyana, but what it does have is a president, Chan Santokhi, who is offering conditions that, no matter how you look at it, are too good to be refused. You see, since the beginning of his mandate and the first major discoveries in Suriname's waters, Santokhi has focused on making the country an oasis for oil investment. For example, instead of offering 20-year production sharing agreements, as many of its South American neighbors do, it is offering them for 30 years, which makes them better for investment, exploration, and production. And not only that, while royalties for oil company revenues average around 16% internationally, Santokhi is offering royalties of only 6.25%, only slightly higher than Guyana. And to top it off, Suriname's offshore oil is light and sweet, meaning it requires less money to get good fuel. Well, all these conditions led the oil company Apache to confirm in September 2023 that the fields in Block 58 would be profitable, meaning that, along with the French company Total Energies, they will invest more than $9 billion to start production in 2028. This is a real boon for a strongly depressed economy such as Suriname's. President Santokhi has assured that the money to be raised from the oil contracts will go towards the much-needed diversification of the economy.
The existence of oil and gas is limited, so we have to use the revenues to diverse the economy to invest in agriculture, in the tourism sector, in housing, infrastructure, for sustainable development in the future.
In other words, oil may signal the end of the economic model that has dominated Suriname since it was a colony. Not surprisingly, Santoki also seeks to address other problems, such as the impoverished conditions in which most of the country's population lives, or the chronic fiscal deficit that has led the government to be mired in debt, and its currency to be significantly devalued in recent years. For the time being, Santoki has already managed, with oil projections in hand, to renegotiate Suriname's debt with some of its creditors.
Suriname emerges from default with US $660 million in oil-related debt.
But wait a moment before you jump the gun, because most analysts are warning of two major threats that could scupper the great aspirations of the inhabitants of this small and impoverished country, who are now so excited about all their bubbly black gold. Pay close attention.
The Suriname parasite.
Like what has been happening in prosperous Guyana, a shadow also lurks in Suriname, the shadow of corruption. As is the case in many other countries of the American continent, Suriname is an eminently corrupt country. Yes, it is true, it has some laws to fight against fraud, money laundering, and smuggling. However, all those efforts have been useless, purely and simply because the most important political figure in the country has profited from all kinds of illicit businesses. We are talking, of course, about the former dictator and now former president, Bouteflika, who has more plots in his credit than an HBO series. There is no doubt at all, analysts agree that Bouteflika turned Suriname into his own private estate. He even used all the power of the state to profit from his business, in some cases linked to international organized crime. You see, after the fall of his second military government in 1991, Bouteflika began to build his own criminal empire. I am talking about what is known as the Suri cartel, which focuses on arms and narcotics trafficking. In fact, in 1999, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison in the Netherlands for drug trafficking offenses and for the murder of 15 civilians in 1982. Bouteflika is so wanted that as of today, he cannot leave Suriname because he has an international arrest warrant issued by Europol. But he is not the only one who has been tried for these crimes. His eldest son, Dino Bouteflika, was even apprehended and convicted in 2015 for nothing short of the following. I think you'll be surprised. Check it out.
Suriname leader's son gets 16 years US prison for Hezbollah aid.
In general, Desi Bouteflika was able to take advantage of the favorable conditions for illicit businesses that Suriname offers. Keep in mind that, being 90% covered by the dense Amazon rainforest, this country is a great hiding place for organized crime. What's more, its population is small, and there are hardly any police forces to control the borders of this vast region, making the trafficking of weapons, drugs, and other goods relatively easy. And that's not all. During the last 40 years, Bouteflika's corruption has seeped into the rest of the layers of the state. The result? These days, in Suriname, clientelism and bribes to officials are a daily occurrence. In fact, one of the main reasons why massive protests erupted in early 2023 was precisely this massive corruption. That is why most analysts, as well as the country's own citizens, fear that the oil money will end up mostly in the hands of corrupt politicians and officials. True, President Santoki is trying to strengthen the fight against corruption, but the reality is that after 40 years of parasitizing the state, Bouteflika has made the task particularly hard. And keep in mind, this is not the only threat to the country's future revenues, or even future oil plans. Several analysts point to another threat that has to do with the conflict over Guyana Essequibo.
Chavismo wins referendum for the annexation of the Essequibo and raises tension with Guyana. Venezuela intensifies the conflict with Guyana over the Essequibo and gives an ultimatum to Exxon and other oil producers.
The Essequibo conflict has shattered the relatively geopolitical stability enjoyed by the territory. Bear in mind that if Venezuela fulfills its promise and annexes the territory, Guyana would lose 74% of its current territory. And let's see, it seems unlikely to happen, but what can I say? With crazy and greedy dictators, you never know. In any case, the risks need to be taken into account. Well, it must be taken into account that, although most of the wells that have given wings to Guyana's economy are not in the territorial waters of Equatorial Guinea, if the latter were to fall into the hands of Venezuela, Guyana would lose important oil fields. In total, it would lose 3 of its 8 current oil fields, and half of the largest and most fruitful so far, the Stabroek field. That is why, VisualPolitik viewers, there are those who are wondering, if Venezuela were to ultimately take the Essequibo, would it be possible that Guyana would start to claim, or even try to take, Suriname's territories to compensate for its losses? In theory, everything points to no. The maritime territorial disputes in oil-rich waters between Guyana and Suriname were already settled in 2007. In fact, the international arbitration gave a much more favorable result to Guyana than to Suriname. As a result, Guyana could not claim waters from Suriname. And what about land territory? Yes, it is true. Both countries have a territorial dispute over a region south of both countries, the Tigray region. However, the reality is that Guyana has controlled this territory with its troops since it breached the agreement with Suriname to withdraw them in 1971. Therefore, Guyana would have no legitimate claim to either the waters or any of Suriname's lands. In fact, the reality is that right now, it would not be in its interest to go up against Suriname following this news.
Suriname supports Guyana in its conflict with Venezuela despite bilateral border issue.
However, what could happen is that the drums of war in the region could be put on hold, and that could slow down many investments, which may delay the oil dreams of a country that could become one of the most promising in the world as early as 2024. So you see, everything points to the next economic miracle staying in the Guyanas, but this time in Suriname. The former Dutch colony has a golden opportunity ahead of it. It certainly has time to prepare and try to correct many of its major problems. After all, the first barrels from the new fields will not start gushing until 2028. But at this point, the questions are now over to you. Do you think Suriname will be able to replicate the success of neighbouring Guyana? What do you think they should do in the face of widespread corruption? Is it possible for big oil to avoid conflict in the Essequibo and in the region? You can leave us your answers in the comments. As always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell icon so you don't miss any updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best, see you soon.